My name is Arthur Klatsky. I'm an adjunct investigator at the Division of Research at Northern California Kaiser Permanente. I had the great pleasure of being invited yet again to present at this excellent meeting on the title, Body Mass Index and Risk of Mortality, is it really healthier to be overweight? Now, interest in body mass index as a predictor of mortality goes back more than 100 years. The original investigators in this area were the insurance companies, whose statistics indicated that people that were overweight were more likely to die. And of course, the insurance companies were interested in rating the premiums up for people that they thought were more likely to die. But more than 100 years ago, the chief medical director for the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company in New York published an article about the J-shaped curve relating BMI to mortality. Underweight people were slightly more likely to die, but overweight people, particularly the very overweight people, were substantially more likely to die. Now, in more recent decades, the criteria that health professionals, and I think a large proportion of the lay public knows, came into widespread use. Overweight was defined as body mass index of 25 to 29, obesity as body mass index of 30 or more, and sometimes obesity was divided into grades, the lowest grade being 30 to 34, that was called class 1 obesity. Many studies, quite a large number of studies, showed that people that were overweight or people that were obese were more likely to die, largely from cardiovascular causes, but also from certain cancers, and from kidney disease and liver disease and other causes. But there always were a few studies that suggested that overweight people might be less likely to die than people of normal weight, meaning people below 25, sometimes excluding the very lean people with body mass index under 18.5. About 2 years ago, a meta-analysis was published in JAMA that reported that overweight people were less likely to die than people of normal weight, and even that class 1 obese people might be less likely to die. This hit the lay press in a big way, and there was some sarcastic comment in the lay press, including an op-ed article in the New York Times entitled, "Our Absurd Fear of Obesity." Now, this created confusion, particularly in a lot of members of the general public, who sort of thought that they really didn't need to control their weight as much as they had been led to believe was important. And that's what led us to look at a large database at the Kaiser Permanente organization and to study the risk of death in relation to obesity. We studied 274,000 people with an average follow-up of 30 or more years, during which time 103,000 died. So this was a huge study. And to get right to the main finding related to this presentation, the people that were overweight were more likely to die. In fact, the men were 9% more likely to die, and the women that were overweight were 22% more likely to die. And for both men and women, those that had class 1 obesity, that's body mass index 30 to 34, were about 50% more likely to die over the 30-plus year period. Now, Asians were a little bit at higher risk if they were overweight, but the increased risk applied to all major racial groups. It was more pronounced in never smokers. It was more pronounced in never smokers and in people who died after 10 years. The people who died in less than 10 years were not as a great risk as those who died after 10 years, and those who died after 20 years were at the highest risk of all. But the biggest difference was between cardiovascular causes of death and non-cardiovascular causes of death. The cardiovascular causes of death were at higher risk in all subgroups. The overweight people were at substantially higher risk even in the first 10 years of dying from cardiovascular disease. Now, for non-cardiovascular disease, the deaths within 10 years for the overweight people were below the relative risk of 1. So there was some evidence that overweight people who died within 10 years were less likely to, that overweight people were less likely to die within the first 10 years. But this was all due to tobacco-related conditions. specifically lung cancer, chronic obstructive lung disease, and pneumonia. So if we eliminated those conditions, there was no evidence that overweight people or class 1 obese people were less likely to die. We concluded from this analysis that it was not the case that it was healthier to be overweight. In fact, it was definitely not healthy to be overweight, particularly from the point of view of cardiovascular risk, and that it was important to follow up the study sample for a long enough period of time to let the effects of obesity appear, which became more pronounced after 10 years and particularly after 20 years. So the bottom line is it is not healthier to be overweight. It's better to be thin, particularly for risk of cardiovascular disease, and this is of particular importance to people who practice preventive cardiology.